This lesson is part of the GRESB Assessment Training Program. In this video, we will review how to complete the Fund Assessment Entity and Reporting Characteristics using the GRESB Assessment Portal. We'll introduce the fund assessment structure, describe its components and its relationship with the asset assessment. Next, we'll look at the aspect and weightings of the fund assessment components and the different types of scores that you can receive based on which components you report. Then we'll walk through the entity characteristics and reporting characteristics and explain how to report these sections. Along the way, we'll briefly explain how peer grouping works and how to link funds to underlying assets within the portal. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to complete the entity and reporting characteristics of the fund assessment. Following this lesson, we recommend that you review the lesson Fund Assessment Management Component. We'll start with an overview of the two infrastructure assessments to establish the context for the fund assessment. GRESB provides two complementary infrastructure assessments, a fund assessment and an asset assessment. Both address critical aspects of ESG performance through a globally applicable and standardized reporting and benchmarking framework. The fund assessment is intended for infrastructure funds and portfolios of assets, while the asset assessment is completed by individual assets. In many cases, these assets will be owned by and form part of an infrastructure fund. Both the fund and asset assessments consist of management and performance components, but it is important to note that a fund does not complete a performance component itself. Instead, the underlying assets of the fund comprise this. If more than 25% of the fund's underlying assets complete the infrastructure asset assessment, the scores of these assets are averaged and the fund will obtain a performance score infrastructure fund. For the asset assessment score to contribute to the performance score of a participating fund, the fund must be linked to the asset. There is a simple process for this that is described in detail in the lesson Fund Assessment Performance Component. Now let's focus on the fund assessment. The GRESB Infrastructure Fund Assessment is the global standard for ESG benchmarking and reporting for listed infrastructure companies and private infrastructure funds. As mentioned earlier, the fund assessment has two components, management and performance. The management component measures the entity's strategy and leadership management, policies and processes, risk management, and stakeholder engagement approaches, and comprises information collected at the entity level. The performance component measures the entity's performance, comprised of information collected at the asset level. It is suitable for any infrastructure company or fund with operational assets. A fund does not complete a performance component itself. Instead, its underlying assets submit their own assessments. If more than 25% of the fund's underlying assets complete the infrastructure asset assessment, the scores of these assets are averaged and the fund will obtain a performance score infrastructure fund. Looking in a little more detail, there are some additional parts to the assessment. The entity and reporting characteristics identify the asset entity and describe its main characteristics and how it will report. These characteristics inform both the management and performance components. The GRESB Resilience module is an optional supplement to the infrastructure assessments. The Resilience module evaluates how infrastructure companies are identifying and assessing long-term trends, preparing for potentially disruptive events and changing conditions, and ultimately becoming more resilient over time. The module aligns with the recommendations of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD. There is a separate lesson on this module. Each of these assessment components is shown in the menu at the top left corner in the portal, as shown here. Let's take a look at the aspects and weightings of the components of the fund assessment. The management component makes up 30% of the fund assessment, and the performance component makes up 70%. The management component consists of 5 aspects: leadership, policies, reporting, risk management, and stakeholder engagement. It is composed of 17 indicators, here represented by the green circles, 13 of which are scored indicators. This chart shows the scoring weightings of each aspect. The risk management aspect, at 13.2%, has the highest aspect weighting, followed by leadership at 7.6%. Funds do not complete a performance component in themselves. Instead, the underlying assets of the fund complete it. The performance component accounts for 70% of the GRESB score infrastructure fund. At least 25% of the fund's underlying investments by equity share need to participate to complete this component for a fund. In this diagram, we see the names of the different fund scores. The score for the management component is called Management Score Infrastructure Fund. This component is weighted at 30% of the overall GRESB Infrastructure Fund assessment, and so the total score is also out of 30 points for this component. The score for the performance component is called the Performance Score Infrastructure Asset, and is also the weighted average asset score, and is out of 70 total points. The overall or combined score for the fund is called the GRESB Score Infrastructure Fund, and is out of 100 points. Now let's take a look at the characteristics part of the fund assessment. Starting with the entity characteristics, these identify the characteristics that remain constant across different reporting years. These are entered into the first portal page titled New Fund Entity after creating a new entity. For returning participants, these are pre-filled but should be checked and updated if necessary. The entity name will be used to identify the entity on the GRESB portal and will be displayed in the entity's benchmark report. It should be readily identifiable as the fund. The organization name should be that of the organization that manages the fund, typically the fund manager. The next indicator focuses on the entity's nature of ownership. The purpose of this indicator is to describe the ownership status and characteristics of the participating entity. It is very important to provide the correct nature of ownership because this status is used by GRESB to define peer groups and to share results. Data collected through the fund assessment is only disclosed to the participants themselves and in the case of non-listed infrastructure funds, to GRESB investor members that request access to the funds in the portal. The participant decides whether to accept or to deny these requests. And in the case of listed infrastructure funds, to all GRESB investor members that hold an infrastructure listed dataset subscription. If the entity is publicly listed, then you will be required to provide an International Securities Identification Number or ISIN. For the next indicator, EC3, state the year when the fund was first commenced or established. For listed funds, the year of commencement applies. This is the year in which the fund began investing in the market. For non-listed funds, the year of establishment applies. This is the year in which the vehicle was launched, the initial capital subscription was completed, and the commitment period commenced. This indicator simply sets the entity's annual reporting year. If reporting using calendar year, select that option. If reporting using a different year, fiscal or financial, then select that option and specify the starting month. You must use the most recently closed reporting year. All responses in the assessment must refer to the selected reporting year. See the table for details. Reporting characteristics describe the entity, define the reporting scope for the current reporting year, and determine the structure of the assessment submission. The reporting currency is stated in Indicator RC1 and must be used consistently throughout the assessment. In RC2, participants specify the entity's economic size in terms of aggregate gross asset value and aggregate net asset value. The monetary values must be completed in millions. The aggregate gross asset value should reflect the value of the assets owned by the entity. The aggregate net asset value, NAV, or invested capital should be the total equity invested in assets by the entity. The aggregate NAV is equal to the aggregate GAV minus the aggregate debt. Like all information provided to GRESB, this information will be kept confidential. Only you and any investors to whom you give permission will have access to this. The indicator on sector and geography requires the participant to assign any sector and regional focus for the fund. This information is used for peer grouping. Let's take a look at how peer groups are set for benchmarking purposes. Each participant is assigned to a peer group based on the entity's sector, location, and nature of ownership. To ensure participant anonymity, GRESB will only create a peer group if there is a minimum of 6 participants allocated to the peer group, the participant plus 5 other peers. Peer group assignments do not affect an entity's score, but determine how GRESB puts participants' results into context. The goal of the peer group creation process is to compare participants who share important characteristics, while A, maintaining a minimum threshold of 6, and B, having less than 50% of the participants in the group from the same company. This table explains how peer group allocation works. We first look at the most granular level in terms of sector focus. If there are 6 participants with this focus, then we check whether there are enough participants with the same regional focus and nature of ownership to create a peer group. If there are fewer than 6 participants with the same nature of ownership, then we go through the same process without taking into account the nature of ownership and so forth. RC5 asks you to provide a description of the fund. This may include purpose of the entity's operations, the service or services provided by the fund, ownership and governance, market position of the entity, and a link to the website. The entity can also upload the company logo, which is used for marketing purposes such as Sector Leader Award attributions. RC6, the summary of entity assets, plays an important role in the fund assessment as it is where the fund lists its underlying asset investments and where these investments can contribute to the performance score of the fund and ultimately, in combination with the management score, to the GRESB score for the fund. Enter the name of the asset weight, and select the sector and nature of investment of the entity, and if applicable, the reason it is excluded from scoring. If the fund requests a connection to an asset, an email will be sent to the account manager or managers of the entity, and a notification will appear in the assessment portal page on the links icon. Accepting the connection is at the discretion of the account manager of the asset entity and will enable the fund to have access to the score and data provided by the asset. See the dedicated lesson on fund assessment performance components for more detail. Thank you for taking the time to complete this lesson. We hope that it helps you get a better understanding of the GRESB infrastructure asset assessment and prepared you to complete the assessment accurately. For any questions, you can contact us at gresb.com/contact.